The silence in the Higgins boat was broken only by the rhythmic slap of waves against the steel hull and the occasional metallic clink of rifle bolts being checked for the 100th time. Private First Class Tommy Kowalski pressed his back against the cramped landing craft's side, feeling the vibration of the diesel engines through shoulder blades. Around him, 30 other Marines sat in two tight rows, their faces pale green in the dim morning light filtering through the salt spray. Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on his M1 Garand. Not from fear, at least, that's what he told himself, but from the cold Pacific dawn and the diesel fumes that made his stomach churn. He'd been 19 for exactly 2 months, long enough to finish boot camp at Paris Island and get shipped to the 1st Marine Division staging area in New Zealand, but nowhere near long enough to feel ready for this. "Mary and Joseph," whispered Corporal Martinez beside him, his rosary beads clicking softly between his fingers. "Look at that." Through the morning haze, the dark silhouette of Guadalcanal emerged like a sleeping giant. Palm trees swayed along beaches that looked deceptively peaceful, their fronds catching the early light. Behind them, jungle-covered mountains rose into low-hanging clouds. It was beautiful in a way that made Tommy's chest tight with homesickness for Pennsylvania's rolling hills. "Looks like paradise," muttered someone from the back of the boat. "Paradise full of Japs." Sergeant Kowalski, no relation despite the name, growled from his position near the bow. "Keep your heads in the game, Marines." "We hit the beach in 10 minutes. The sergeant's words cut through whatever romantic notions anyone might have harbored. Tommy felt his breakfast, powdered eggs and coffee that tasted like motor oil, threatened to come back up. He swallowed hard and tried to focus on what he'd learned in training. Keep your head down. Follow orders. Watch your buddies' backs. The boat's engine had changed pitch, and the coxswain called out, 2 minutes. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs. Around him, Marines checked their gear one final time. Ammunition, water, first aid kits, grenades, everything a man needed to survive in hell. The metallic symphony of 30 men preparing for war filled the cramped space. The snap of helmet chin straps, the slide of rifle bolts, the rustle of canvas equipment. "Remember what we practiced." Sergeant Kowalski shouted over the engine noise. "Off the boat, spread out, move inland fast. Don't bunch up on the beach. The Japs will have that zeroed in." Through gaps in the boat's sides, Tommy caught glimpses of other landing craft spreading out in a rough line, each one carrying its cargo of nervous young men toward an uncertain fate. Somewhere behind them, the big guns of the fleet thundered, sending shells screaming over their heads toward the Japanese positions inland. The naval bombardment had been going on for what felt like hours, turning the jungle beyond the beaches into a hell of smoke and fire. Tommy hoped it had done its job, that there wouldn't be much left of whatever defenses the Japanese had built. But training had taught him to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. 30 seconds. The boat lurched as it scraped against sand. Tommy's stomach dropped as if he were on a carnival ride, but this was no game. Through the steel sides, he could hear other boats grinding ashore, engines revving as they fought against the surf and sand. "This is it. Boys." Sergeant Kowalski stood up, his M1 ready. "Remember your training. Look out for each other, and let's show these Japs what Marines can do." The front ramp dropped with a metallic crash, and suddenly the boat was full of Pacific sunlight and the smell of cordite and tropical vegetation. For a split second, nobody moved. Then Sergeant Kowalski charged forward with a war whoop, and 30 Marines followed him into history. Tommy's boots hit the sand running. The beach was wider than it had looked from the boat, maybe 50 yards of white sand stretching between the surf and the tree line. To his left and right, dozens of other landing craft were disgorging their human cargo, turning the peaceful tropical morning into a chaos of shouting men, revving engines, and the crash of waves. But there was no gunfire. Tommy had expected to run into a wall of Japanese bullets the moment he left the boat. Instead, he found himself splashing through knee-deep water, then running across sand that was almost eerily quiet except for the sounds of the landing itself. Palm trees swayed peacefully in the morning breeze. A few tropical birds called from the jungle beyond. "Where are they?" Martinez panted, keeping pace beside him. "Don't look a gift horse in the mouth," Tommy replied, but he felt the same confusion. This was supposed to be the hard part. The Japanese were supposed to contest the landing to try to drive them back into the sea. Instead, it felt almost like a training exercise. They reached the tree line and threw themselves down behind a fallen log. Sergeant Kowalski was already there, studying the jungle ahead through binoculars. "Anything, Sarge?" asked Private Johnson, a lanky kid from Georgia who'd joined the company in New Zealand. "Nothing moving," the sergeant replied. "But that doesn't mean they're not there. Could be pulling back to prepared positions." Over the next hour, as more Marines came ashore and the beachhead expanded, the mystery only deepened. A few scattered rifle shots echoed from the jungle, but nothing like the fierce resistance they'd expected. By noon, advance patrols had reached the objective that planners had thought might take days to capture, a half-finished airfield that the Japanese had been building. Tommy found himself part of a squad detailed to secure one of the captured Japanese positions. It was his first close look at the enemy's work, and it impressed him despite himself. The bunker was expertly camouflaged and positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire with other positions. If the Japanese had stayed to fight from these positions, the landing would have been a bloodbath. "Look at this," Martinez called from deeper in the bunker. Tommy crawled over to find his friend examining scattered equipment and personal items. Rice bowls with food still in them, cigarettes that were still warm, a half-written letter in Japanese characters. "They left in a hurry," Tommy observed. "Real hurry," Martinez agreed. "Question is, where'd they go?" The answer came 3 days later. Tommy crouched in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to Sergeant Kowalski brief the patrol. Around him, 8 other Marines checked their gear by feel. Everything had to be done quietly now, because they were no longer alone in the jungle. "Intelligence says there's a strong point about 2 miles inland," the sergeant whispered. "Our job is to find it. Count heads if we can, and get back without starting World War III all by ourselves." The landing might have been easy, but the Japanese hadn't disappeared. They'd pulled back into the jungle, and for 3 days now, Marines pushing inland had been running into increasing resistance. Sniper fire from invisible positions, booby traps that could take a man's leg off, and always, the feeling of being watched by eyes that never shot themselves. Tommy had barely slept since the landing. None of them had. The jungle never got quiet. It was full of sounds that could be wind in the leaves or could be enemy soldiers moving through the undergrowth. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of vegetation, every call of a tropical bird could mean death. "Johnson, your point," Sergeant Kowalski continued. "Martinez, bring up the rear. Everybody else, 5-yard intervals, stay alert, and for God's sake, don't shoot unless you're sure of your target." They moved out as the sky was just beginning to lighten. The jungle was different away from the coast, denser, darker, full of vines and fallen trees that made progress slow and exhausting. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. Within minutes, Tommy's uniform was soaked with sweat. Johnson set a careful pace, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The jungle floor was treacherous with hidden roots and soft spots where a man could sink up to his knees in mud. Worse, the Japanese had been busy during their withdrawal. Tommy counted 3 booby traps in the first mile, improvised mines made from artillery shells, designed to maim rather than kill outright. The further they went, the more signs they found of recent Japanese occupation, camouflaged positions, fire pits that had been carefully concealed but were still warm, and everywhere the feeling that they were being watched. Tommy was fourth in line when it happened. Johnson had just rounded a bend in what might generously be called a trail when the jungle exploded. Rifle fire cracked from 3 directions at once, muzzle flashes blinking like deadly fireflies in the green gloom. Johnson spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. "Contact front," Sergeant Kowalski roared, diving behind a moss-covered log. "Spread out." Training took over. Tommy rolled right, found cover behind a tree trunk, and brought his AM-1 up. But there was nothing to shoot at. The Japanese were invisible, hidden in spider holes and camouflaged positions that had probably taken weeks to prepare. A bullet spanged off the tree inches from Tommy's head, showering him with bark. He flinched and tried to spot the shooter, but the jungle was a maze of shadows and green leaves. Another bullet whined overhead, then another. "I can't see them," Martinez yelled from somewhere to Tommy's left. "Doesn't matter," Sergeant Kowalski shouted back. "Put fire on those muzzle flashes." Tommy aimed at where he'd seen a brief flicker of flame and squeezed the trigger. His M1 kicked against his shoulder, and he immediately shifted position, knowing that his own muzzle flash had given away his location. Good thing, too, a burst of automatic fire chewed up the ground where he'd been lying. The firefight lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. Tommy burned through 2 8-round clips, firing at shadows and sounds and brief glimpses of movement that might have been enemy soldiers or might have been his imagination. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke and the sound of bullets cracking through the vegetation. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. "Hold fire." "Hold fire," Sergeant Kowalski called out. "Sound off." One by one, the Marines called out their status. Johnson was hit but mobile. Private Stevens had taken a bullet through his pack that had missed him by inches. Everyone else was shaken but intact. "They're pulling back," the sergeant said after listening carefully to the jungle sounds. "Probably trying to draw us deeper into an ambush." Tommy lay behind his tree, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. His first firefight. He'd been shot at by enemy soldiers who wanted to kill him, and he'd shot back. Whether he'd hit anyone, he couldn't say, but the experience had changed something fundamental inside him. The patrol spent another hour in the area, but the Japanese had melted away as silently as ghosts. They found 3 spider holes, expertly camouflaged and positioned for maximum effect. Blood on some leaves suggested that at least one of the enemy had been hit, but there were no bodies. "Welcome to jungle warfare, Marines," Sergeant Kowalski said grimly as they prepared to head back to their lines. "This is what the rest of the war is going to look like." 2 weeks into the campaign, Tommy felt like he'd aged 10 years. The Japanese had finally shown their hand in a series of night attacks that had turned the supposedly secure American beachhead into a hellscape of flares, explosions, and screaming men. They came out of the jungle like ghosts, hitting positions that should have been impossible to approach, then vanishing before the Marines could organize effective counterattacks. Tommy's company had been moved to a defensive position on a ridge overlooking the captured airfield, Henderson Field, as they were calling it now after a Marine pilot killed at Midway. The field was operational, which meant American planes could land and refuel, but it also made them a prime target for Japanese attacks. "Another fun ahead," Martinez muttered, settling into his foxhole as the sun touched the horizon. They'd learned to dread nightfall. That's when the Japanese came alive, when the jungle filled with the sound of movement and whispered commands in a language none of them understood. That's when Marines died. Tommy checked his grenades for the dozenth time, making sure the pins were secure but easy to pull. His foxhole was connected to Martinez's by a shallow trench they'd dug with their entrenching tools. It wasn't much, but it meant they could support each other without exposing themselves to sniper fire. "You scared?" Martinez asked quietly. "Terrified," Tommy admitted. There was no point in lying. They all were. "Good. Means you're paying attention." The night sound started as darkness fell complete. Insects, night birds, and underneath it all, sounds that might have been natural or might have been enemy soldiers moving through the undergrowth. Tommy strained his ears, trying to separate real threats from the paranoia that had become their constant companion. At 2 o'clock hours, all hell broke loose. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, Japanese soldiers emerging from spider holes that must have been dug right under the Marines' noses. Rifles cracked, grenades exploded, and suddenly the night was full of running figures and muzzle flashes. "Here they come," someone shouted, though Tommy couldn't tell who in the chaos. A Japanese soldier appeared at the edge of Tommy's foxhole, bayonet gleaming in the light of a flare someone had fired. Tommy didn't think. He fired his M1 from the hip, the bullet catching the enemy soldier center mass and spinning him around. The man fell backward and didn't move. Tommy's hands shook as he worked his rifle's bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. He'd just killed a man. A human being who'd probably had a family back in Japan, who'd written letters home and dreamed of surviving the war. But there was no time to process the enormity of it. More Japanese soldiers were coming, materializing out of the darkness like demons from hell. "Martinez," Tommy called out. "I'm here," his friend replied, his voice tight with adrenaline and fear. They fought side by side for what felt like hours, though it was probably less than 30 minutes. Tommy lost count of how many times he fired his rifle, how many grenades he threw, how many muzzle flashes he aimed at in the strobing hell of the firefight. At some point, a Japanese grenade landed between their foxholes. Tommy saw it, a dark object that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, and knew with absolute certainty that he was about to die. Martinez saw it too. Without hesitation, he dove from his foxhole and landed on the grenade, covering it with his body. "No!" Tommy screamed, but it was too late. The explosion was muffled by Martinez's sacrifice, but Tommy felt the concussion like a physical blow. His friend's body absorbed most of the shrapnel that would have killed them both. Something broke inside Tommy then. The careful training, the discipline, the fear, all of it evaporated in a white-hot rage that consumed everything else. He climbed out of his foxhole and advanced into the darkness, firing his M1 and screaming curses in English, Polish, and languages he didn't even know he knew. Later, when the sun came up and they counted the bodies, Surgeon Kowalski found Tommy sitting beside Martinez's corpse, still holding his rifle but no longer seeing anything around him. "He saved my life," Tommy whispered. "I know," the sergeant replied gently. "He saved all our lives." That grenade would have taken out half the position. They buried Martinez that afternoon in a temporary cemetery behind the aid station. Tommy stood with the rest of the company as a chaplain read words over his friend's grave, but he wasn't really listening. All he could think about was the rosary beads that Martinez had clicked during that first boat ride to the beach. The beads were back at the company's seat now, along with a letter Martinez had been writing to his mother in San Antonio. October brought the rains and the Japanese army. Tommy had been on Guadalcanal for 2 months now, long enough to become one of the old hands despite his age. New replacements looked to him for guidance, which seemed absurd given that he still felt like a scared kid most of the time. But he'd survived when others hadn't, and in the arithmetic of infantry warfare, survival was the only qualification that mattered. The Japanese had finally committed serious forces to retaking Henderson Field. Intelligence estimated that they were facing at least 20,000 enemy soldiers, maybe more. Against that, the Marines had maybe 12,000 effectives, counting the Army units that had recently arrived. The math wasn't encouraging. "Word is they're going to hit us tonight," Sergeant Kowalski said during the daily briefing. He looked older than his 30 years, worn down by weeks of constant combat and the responsibility of keeping his men alive. "Big push, everything they've got." Tommy nodded along with the others, but inside he felt something that went beyond fear into a kind of numb acceptance. They'd beaten off a dozen smaller attacks. If this was the big one, then this was where they'd find out if 2 months in hell had made them strong enough to survive. His squad had been assigned to hold a section of the perimeter near the airfield's eastern edge. It wasn't the most glamorous position, but it was critical. If the Japanese broke through there, they could roll up the entire American line. As darkness fell, Tommy settled into the improved foxhole he'd been working on for 3 days. It was deeper now, with overhead cover and firing ports that would let him engage targets without exposing himself completely. He'd learned a lot about staying alive since that first night attack. The Japanese artillery started at 2,100 hours. It was different from anything they'd faced before, heavier, more sustained, obviously the prelude to something big. Shells screamed overhead and crashed into the American positions with earth-shaking explosions that rattled Tommy's teeth. He pressed himself against the bottom of his foxhole and tried to become one with the mud. The bombardment went on for 2 hours. When it finally stopped, the sudden quiet was almost as terrifying as the explosions had been. "Here they come," someone whispered, and Tommy could hear the fear in the man's voice. They came in waves, thousands of them, screaming battle cries and charging across open ground that should have been impossible to cross. But there were so many of them that they simply absorbed the casualties and kept coming. Tommy opened fire when the first wave was 50 yards out, his M1 bucking against his shoulder as he worked the trigger as fast as he could. Around him, the entire American line erupted in a continuous roar of gunfire. Machine guns chattered, rifles cracked, and grenades exploded in the charging masses. But still they came. The first wave hit the wire and died there, caught in the barbed wire obstacles and cut down by concentrated fire. But the second wave used their bodies as bridges, climbing over the dead and dying to reach the American positions. A Japanese soldier leaped into the foxhole next to Tommy's, bayonet aimed at Private Wilson, a replacement who'd arrived just the week before. Tommy swung his rifle like a club, catching the enemy soldier in the side of the head and dropping him. Wilson nodded his thanks and kept firing. The battle became a series of disconnected moments, each one crystal clear, but part of a larger chaos that Tommy couldn't process. A Japanese officer with a sword, trying to rally his men until Tommy put a bullet through his chest. A grenade that landed in Tommy's foxhole but turned out to be a dud. The sound of Marines calling for ammunition, for medics, for help. At some point during the third wave, Tommy realized his M1 was empty and he was out of ammunition. He'd fired every round in his basic load, thrown every grenade. Around him, other Marines were in the same situation. Fix bayonets. Sergeant Kowalski roared from somewhere in the chaos. Tommy snapped his bayonet onto his rifle's muzzle and prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. This was it. This was where it ended. But the fourth wave never came. As dawn broke over the battlefield, the surviving Japanese soldiers melted back into the jungle, leaving behind hundreds of bodies scattered across the ground in front of the American positions. They'd come closer than any previous attack, actually breaking through the perimeter in 2 places, but in the end they'd broken themselves against the Marines' defense. Tommy sat in his foxhole, looking out at the carnage, and tried to understand what he'd become. 2 months ago, he'd been a scared kid from Pennsylvania. Now he was something else, a survivor, a killer, a Marine who'd held his ground against impossible odds. December 1942. The Japanese were pulling out. Tommy stood on the beach where he'd landed 4 months earlier, watching enemy destroyers on the horizon evacuating what remained of the Japanese garrison. It should have felt like victory, but mostly it just felt like exhaustion. The 1st Marine Division was being relieved by Army units, finally rotating off the island that had become synonymous with hell on earth. Tommy tried to feel grateful, but he'd lost the capacity for most emotions except a kind of grim satisfaction that he'd survived when so many others hadn't. "Hard to believe it's over," said Corporal Johnson. He'd been promoted after Sergeant Kowalski died in the October battle, stepped on a mine while leading a patrol to recover wounded Marines. "Good leaders died on Guadalcanal just like everybody else. It's not over," Tommy replied, watching the Japanese ships disappear over the horizon. This was just the first round. He was right, and they all knew it. The Japanese had lost Guadalcanal, but they still held thousands of islands across the Pacific. There would be other landings, other battles, other friends who wouldn't make it home. Tommy Martinez's rosary beads, which he'd carried since that night attack in October. He'd written to Martinez's mother, trying to explain how her son had died and what it had meant. He'd gotten a letter back, written in Spanish and English, thanking him for bringing her boy's rosary beads home and asking him to light a candle for Martinez in the next church he found. "What are you going to do when we get back to the States?" Johnson asked. Tommy considered the question. The Marine Corps was rotating the division back to Australia for rest and refit, but eventually they'd be back in the Pacific, preparing for the next operation. He could probably get a transfer to a training unit, spend the rest of the war turning civilians into Marines instead of fighting Japanese soldiers in the jungle. But when he thought about it seriously, he knew he wouldn't do that. He'd become something on Guadalcanal that he couldn't just put aside. He'd learned things about himself and about war that couldn't be unlearned. Most importantly, he'd learned that when everything went to hell, Marines stood their ground and looked out for each other. "I'm going to stay," he said finally. "See this thing through." Johnson nodded. He'd probably come to the same conclusion. That night, Tommy sat on the beach and wrote a letter to his parents back in Pennsylvania. He tried to explain what had happened to their son over the past 4 months, how a scared kid had become someone who'd killed enemy soldiers and watched friends die and held his ground when the world was ending around him. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain the sound of Japanese artillery shells screaming overhead, or the sight of Martinez diving on that grenade, or the way jungle rot had eaten holes in his boots? How could he tell them about the nightmares that woke him up screaming, or the way his hand still shook sometimes when he thought nobody was looking. In the end, he kept it simple. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm fine and the island is secure. We did what we came here to do, and now we're moving on to the next job. I can't tell you much about where we're going next, but I want you to know that I'm proud to be a Marine and proud of the men I serve with. Take care of each other, and don't worry about me. I've learned how to take care of myself. Love, Tommy P.S. Please light a candle for my friend Martinez. He saved my life, and I promised his mother I'd ask you to do that. 3 days later, Tommy boarded a transport ship for Australia. As Guadalcanal faded behind them, he stood at the rail with the other survivors of the 1st Marine Division and tried to process what they'd accomplished. They'd stopped the Japanese advance across the Pacific. They'd proven that the enemy could be beaten in a straight-up fight. They'd paid for that knowledge with blood and friends and pieces of their souls. But they'd done what needed to be done. And they'd do it again, as many times as necessary, until the war was won and they could all go home. Tommy touched Martinez's rosary beads one more time, then went below to write in the journal he'd started keeping. Someday, when he was old and the war was just history, he wanted to remember what it had been like to be young and scared and far from home, fighting for something bigger than himself alongside men who'd become closer than brothers. Someday, he'd want to remember what it meant to be a Marine. The Battle of Guadalcanal lasted from August 7, 1942, to February 9, 1943. It marked the first major Allied land victory against Japan in the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 1,200 killed and 2,800 wounded during their 4 months on the island. Their sacrifice stopped Japanese expansion across the Pacific and began the long road back to Tokyo.